And as Buddhists, it's befitting that no matter what tradition we have, we try and have the same motivation that the Buddha did. And so we see very clearly that the Buddha wanted the highest good for all sentient beings. And so he taught so that we could attain liberation from samsara, so that we could become fully awakened Buddhas and be able to benefit sentient beings. So since the Buddha taught with that kind of ultimate, far-reaching motivation, then let us have that same motivation, seeking liberation and especially seeking full awakening for the benefit of all beings. So, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit how the book got written and what His Holiness's purpose was in writing the book, because that will really set the stage for what's to come. So I was working on a project with His Holiness on a much larger book about the stages of the path. And he very specifically said that he wanted teachings from other traditions, Buddhist traditions, in it. And then it became clear that what he also wanted was a whole book, talking about the different viewpoints of the different traditions. So of course it's impossible. There's so many Buddhist traditions to include all of them here. So we basically just talked about the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition, and within the Sanskrit tradition, where the Chinese tradition had unique points, and we spoke of it separately. But His Holiness's purpose was, he said that he as an individual had more contact with people from other religions, with Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Sikhs, than he did with other Buddhists. And he said it shouldn't be this way. And, and he also saw the amount of misunderstanding that exists among Buddhist traditions. And so he wanted a book so that Buddhists could get to know something about each other in an accurate way. Yeah, because, Buddhism spread to so many different geographical places, was translated into so many different languages, had so many different cultural influences in each place it went, that people from one place never knew people from the other place. And if they did, they couldn't talk to them because they didn't know the same language. Yeah, and so I really saw this when I lived in Singapore, where people thought that, because Singapore is mostly Chinese, I was from the Tibetan tradition, and so some people thought I did magic, because that's one of the misconceptions that the Chinese have about the Tibetans, is they perform magic. So I had to, please excuse myself, no, I couldn't tell you your lucky number, and, and I couldn't do exorcisms and this kind of thing. So, then on the other hand, the Tibetan think that the Chinese all do blank-minded meditation and, and are just spaced out in their meditation. Yeah. The Theravada think both the Chinese and the Tibetans are following scriptures that aren't even the Buddha's word, so they're following false paths. And of course, the Chinese and the Tibetans see the Theravadas as selfish because they're aiming for their own liberation. So you have these kind of, misconceptions that have been passed down generation to generation, that just create this unnecessary suspicion amongst people who are practitioners of different traditions. And in the West, for over 2 decades now, we've had once a year a Western Buddhist monastic gathering where the monastics, Western monastics and Asian monastics who live in the West, come together as friends. We don't present papers or anything. We come together as friends and learn about each other and really share our experience of being monastics. And so I think we've really been able to overcome some of these kind of wrong conceptions that are just really far out. And it would be nice in Asia if this could happen as well, so that all the Buddhists could really come together and act with a united voice when it comes to issues like nonviolence and human rights and environmental degradation and things like that. Yeah. So I think that's one of His Holiness's, well, I know that's one of His Holiness's purposes in having the book written. Because, and the book could have been written in a very simple way, like, yes, all Buddhists bow, they just bow differently, and they all make offerings, but they offer different things, and they all chant, but they chant in different languages. But, you can read that kind of thing in a college textbook about Buddhism. And so this book really goes into the doctrines of the tradition, so people can really, see, like, what's the doctrine? How is the practice done? And that's where you can really see so much in common. And in some cases, you can see differences as well. And His Holiness was very clear that we don't whitewash the differences. Also he says when we have interfaith dialogue, we don't whitewash the differences. There are differences. But having differences doesn't mean that we can't get along. And especially when you see the Buddha as a skillful teacher who is trying to reach out and appeal to a wide variety of people who had different ways of thinking and different interests and different tendencies and different predispositions, So the Buddha was quite aware that it's not one size fits all. So he would say different things to different people in his 45 years of ministry. And it was very often, it was completely in accord with what that particular audience needed to hear at that particular time. Yeah. The teachings were later systematized more or less in different ways by different traditions. Some traditions, the Tibetans, I think, really systematized things quite a lot. The Huayan and Tendai in China systematized things a lot. The Theravada, it was spoken about in our recent monastic conference, that the Nikayas, are just one sutra after the other, and they don't build on what was spoken of in the sutra before. So one topic is talked about in many different Nikayas. But they still, condense it and have regular themes that are taught. Okay, so that's how the book came to be written. And we use the terms Pali tradition and Sanskrit tradition as inadequate as they are, because we certainly didn't want to use Mahayana and Hinayana. Hinayana is terribly offensive, also inaccurate. Or even His Holiness sometimes calls the hearer and solitary realizer vehicles the fundamental vehicle. But then that gets confusing because the Sanskrit teachings also have fundamental vehicle teachings in it. So, we have all these different categories, but they all overlap and they're very difficult, you can't really tease them apart. And this goes for talking about Sanskrit and Pali traditions as well. Okay? Because the Pali tradition, we can refer to the Pali Canon, and many people think, that's just, in Tibetan terms, the Vaibhasika and Satantrika view. No, not exactly. There are some similarities with that, but the Abbey Dharma in the Theravada tradition is not strictly Vaibhasika, Satantrika. And also, what many people don't know is that there is a bodhisattva vehicle taught in the Pali scriptures. It's there. So you can't say, these people are all, striving to be arhats and not Buddhas, and that's the difference. No, because there is a bodhisattva vehicle taught. Okay? I mean, the Buddha was a bodhisattva and became a Buddha, so there must have been a bodhisattva vehicle, if you think about it. Come on. Okay. And then similarly, in the Sanskrit tradition, you have the paths that lead to full awakening, and you have the paths that lead to arhatship. They're all there. Okay? So it's hard. We really couldn't find any completely suitable names. Okay? We could talk about the three vehicles. Okay? The hearer vehicle, Pratyeka Buddha or solitary realizer vehicle, and the Bodhisattva vehicle. Yeah, but all three of them are taught in both the Pali tradition and the Sanskrit tradition. Okay, so maybe that's the clearest way, but are you getting what I mean? It's like we have all these terms and categories, but you can see that they're merely labeled and that they don't have any kind of strict, rigid definitions. Okay, so we just picked something that we thought would do. Okay. And like I said, we certainly couldn't include all the different traditions that are subdivisions of the Pali tradition, all the different traditions that are subdivisions of the Sanskrit tradition. Yeah, you can't do that, because there's so many, and we'd still be writing the book if we tried to do that. Okay. So I thought I would just kind of give you an overview of what's in the book that we'll be covering. I am not promising to finish this within the 2 weeks. In fact, knowing how I work, I don't know how far we'll get at all. Okay, but we'll continue later. So we start out with a chapter on the origin and spread of the Buddhist doctrine, because I wanted people, I thought people should have some idea of, a little bit about the history, the canons, and what Buddhism is like in different Buddhist countries. Yeah, because I think that's important, because Buddhism exists within a culture. It exists in a place. And I know when I first encountered the Dharma and heard the Tibetan teachings, I had this idea like, I'm getting it exactly as the Buddha taught it, without any cultural overlays or influences at all. And after many years of practice, I realized, no, that was not the case. Yeah, that the Dharma has to exist within a culture because it's taught for human beings, and wherever you have human beings, you have culture. And different cultures are going to influence different things. Different governmental structures, we'll see this when we get into the first chapter, influence how the Dharma institutions are organized. Different climate influences how you practice. Yeah? So I think that kind of approach is very helpful, so that we don't see the Dharma as some truly existent thing that never changes. I mean, the Dharma teachings can't change, because if you change the Dharma teachings, then you lose the liberating path. But what Dharma looks like on the outside, those kind of things change. The difficulty is telling one from the other. Yeah, that's the hard part. Okay, the second chapter is about refuge in the three jewels, because that's something, maybe the principal thing that's common to all the Buddhist traditions. And then the third chapter is the 16 attributes of the Four Truths, okay? Commonly called the Four Noble Truths, except that title it's kind of misleading, because there's nothing noble about suffering. Actually, suffering is not a very good translation either. So we just settled on calling it the Four Truths of the Aryas being beings who have realized the nature of reality directly. Okay, so the 16 attributes, the Four Noble Truths, and then because, you have dukkha, or unsatisfactory conditions, its causes, its cessation, and its path. When you talk of the Four Truths, when you look at the path more closely, you get the three higher trainings. So the next three chapters are corresponding to that. The higher training in ethical conduct, practiced by all the traditions. The higher training in concentration, again, practiced in all the traditions. And the higher training in wisdom. And here we have one chapter on the 37 aids to awakening. Sometimes I call it the 37 harmonies with awakening, okay, which was one of the main practices. And then another chapter on selflessness and emptiness, which are also part of the higher training in wisdom. Okay, then we get into dependent arising from the viewpoint of the 12 links as they're presented in both traditions, and then the three kinds of dependent arising that the Tibetans speak of quite a lot. From there we go into uniting serenity and insight as the way to, generate the higher training in wisdom. And then that leads us into talking about the different stages of the path. So there's a chapter called Progressing on the Path, where we talk about the different steps that you go through as you're, according to the both traditions, as you're going towards arhatship or bodhisattvahood. Okay, and a discussion of what nirvana is, which is quite interesting. From there we go into the four immeasurables, and then a chapter on bodhicitta, and one on the bodhisattva trainings in the perfections. So these chapters are not, unique to the Sanskrit tradition, okay, or to what we call the Mahayana. The four immeasurables are taught in the Pali tradition, And I remember when His Holiness, he was teaching, must have been in Arizona in 1993, and they had some speakers in the evening from different Buddhist traditions giving talks. And so Søren Salzberg gave a talk on the four immeasurables. And I remember one of my dear Dharma friends, who has been a practitioner and a scholar, a Buddhist scholar for ages, was totally blown away and said to me, they talked about love and compassion. It was like he didn't know that, because the whole Tibetan party line is that unless you are aiming for Buddhahood, you're selfish, and there's no love or compassion involved at all. And that's totally wrong. That's one of these, outmoded misconceptions that's been passed down. So I remember so clearly. It's like, what? You don't know that they teach the four immeasurables? You're totally clueless. Okay. So, four immeasurables, bodhicitta, the bodhisattva trainings. Okay. And then the possibility of awakening in the Buddha nature. Okay. So is liberation possible? And what is the nature of the mind that permits this? Okay. And then from there, a short chapter on Tantra, because Tantra is vastly misunderstood, both by the Chinese and by the Theravadas, and by the Tibetans and the Westerners. So I thought something, we thought some, simple chapter about Tantra, just to clear up, that no, not everybody is going around drinking and sleeping with each other. And, that's not what people who practice Tantra do. But this is, what some people think. So, yeah. Which reminds me, one time when I was living in Hong Kong, teaching at the Dharma Center there, one man invited me for lunch, and I accepted. And then when we're eating lunch, he starts asking me if I do tantric practice. His definition of tantric practice. I said, I think I need to go home now. This is the kind of wrong conception. So, yeah. Okay, so I also should say that there's a lot of people that need to be acknowledged in the writing of this book, from the Buddha on down, all the lineage teachers. Yeah. And, His Holiness is just amazing, his outreach, his way of putting forth the Dharma. So I felt extremely privileged to be able to work on this book with him. Some of my other teachers and my Dharma friends helped as well. And there were translators from His Holiness's office who looked over the material and corrected it. And, of course, the people at Wisdom who did a wonderful job of publishing it. Isn't that beautiful? I think that's gorgeous. Yeah. Okay, so my idea in going through the chapters was I would read the book. I would like you all to read ahead, but I would read and then stop at different places to make comments. Okay? So, not all people think alike. They have different needs, interests, and dispositions in almost every area of life. Isn't that true? Including religion. As a skillful teacher, the Buddha gave various teachings to correspond to the variety of sentient beings. We're going to look at the development of the two major Buddhist traditions containing these teachings, the Pali and Sanskrit traditions. But first we begin with the life story of the Buddha. So I'm not going to read from the book there. I think most people are familiar with it. But there's a few highlights of the Buddha's life story that I think are very important. First of all, the Buddha lived in a very protected environment, and he had to sneak out of the palace and to get some sense of the world around him. And it was only when he did that he saw aging, sickness, and death, and saw a wandering mendicant. So in some ways, I think that applies to many, but not all, contemporary people who are coming to Buddhism, who did not grow up Buddhist. We grew up in affluent cultures, very protected from the rest of the world. We would hear what's going on in the news, but we put old people in homes. Death is hidden and sanitized, and so kind of like the Buddha, we sometimes are shocked by the suffering we see in the world, and that's what propels people to get interested in religion. Okay, the Buddha, of course, his parents wanted, his father especially, his mother had died shortly after his birth, but his father wanted him to follow in the family business, which was being ruler of the country. So it's kind of like our parents want us to go to school, have a good career, make lots of money, have kids, do what your parents want. And the Buddha couldn't do that. He had a spiritual longing that, clearly was not fulfilled. So he had, there's the story about the dancing girls, and then he saw them all when they were asleep, and he ran, when his wife had just had a child, and he left that night. Well, it's like he had his own disco in the palace and his own raves there. He didn't even need to go outside the palace. Very similar to our lives. And then people have kids. He wasn't involved in driving them to all their after-school activities, but, you can see what's entailed in raising a child. And his spiritual urge was so strong that he knew he couldn't seriously practice in that kind of environment. And also he didn't have a teacher there. Yeah, and without a teacher that you have confidence in, what are you going to do? So he left the palace, and of course his family was, going berserky. Yeah, I brought you up, and now you're doing this. What are all my friends, the other kings and royalties, what are they going to say about what my child's done? And I got you all these clothes and all this jewelry, and you had beautiful long hair, and you cut your hair, and you sent the clothes and jewelry back when you left the palace, and you snuck out, you didn't even say goodbye. You could modernize this scene. And so I think there's a lot to learn from this, and that the Buddha's life is a teaching in itself, and that he was, his spiritual longing was so strong that he had to do what he did. And he wasn't out to hurt anybody. In fact, he was out to benefit them. But he saw that unless he solved the problem of, countless rebirths, just, doing the same thing as his parents wasn't going to lead him anywhere. And I'm sure he recognized that it hurt them. I'm sure, some people accuse the Buddha of being a deadbeat dad. I've heard people say that. He was anything but a deadbeat dad. His motivation was for the benefit of all sentient beings. And he made sure that, his wife and child were cared for. As it later turned out, both his wife and child ordained. And his stepmother, who brought him up, also did. And his father eventually came around. Okay? But you have to see the Buddha's inner courage and inner strength to do that. Then he went out, he met teachers who taught him meditation techniques. He mastered them. They were all techniques to develop single-pointed concentration, and he went right up the ladder of the meditative absorptions in the form and formless realms. He saw that they didn't lead to liberation either. So then he tried ascetic practices. So this is kind of like in Catholicism, really until Vatican II, and still now to some extent. There's these quite ascetic practices. I know the Irish Catholics would jump in the freezing sea, and and then the whips and You people who grew up Catholic know better than I do, but you know, there was a lot of self-flagellation and with hair vests, hair shirts, those kinds of things. Yeah, so it's this same thing in all the cultures of, well, if we make the body suffer, maybe that will conquer our attachment to the body, you know. But and so the Buddha did that for 6 years with his 5 friends. His Holiness says he loves the statue of the Buddha, the very thin Buddha. Have you ever seen it? There's one in Pakistan in one museum. He got so thin that when he touched his navel, he could feel his spine. And, you know, he looks horrible. He looks like he came out of a concentration camp. But this was, you know, the kind of asceticism that some people practiced then. But then what was amazing is he was smart enough to realize that that didn't bring the proper result. And so he left it. So, you know, before, when he left the indulgent life of the palace, his parents criticized him. When he left the ascetic practice with his 5 companions, they criticized him. But he had to follow his heart. Yeah. Now, we might say, well, the Buddha didn't have a teacher. How did he get enlightened? The thing is that, you know, this wasn't his first life. There were many, many lives before that where he had practice. So he had a lot of the imprints in his mind stream. Here we're looking at the Buddha from the common viewpoint. Yeah. And so he crossed the river, sat under the tree in Bodh Gaya, and said he wasn't going to get up until he attained full awakening. And then all hell broke loose in his meditation. You know, what happened? You know, the story is so great because it just describes our experience. You know, what happens? First, was it the dancing girls first? Yeah, so first the dancing girls all come, you know. So you have, what is it, Miss Universe? The Miss Universe contest. The euphoria. So, you know, you have all that in the meditation. It's the other way around. It's the anger first. Okay, so, yeah. So first, you know, he had Isis, in his mind. I mean, because this is what it is, you know, everybody's attacking you. And you know how we sometimes get when we get suspicious, when we get paranoid, when we're so angry that we project harm outside. I mean, this is what happens in our meditation, and this is what happens in our life, and that's the meaning of, you know, all these people, warriors coming with all of their weapons to attack him. And they say it's a manifestation of Mara. Mara's the embodiment of evil, you know, but it's actually creations of one's own mind. Now, Mara's not an external being like that. Okay, but he had to calm all of that stuff going on in his mind by practicing love and compassion and fortitude and transforming them all into flower petals. Okay, so that's really what we need to do with the people who we consider our enemies, who we don't like. Is see that this is coming from our mind, and these are sentient beings who are just trying to be happy and not suffer, and no sense being angry at them. Okay, when he overcame that, then the dancing girls and Miss Universe pageants started. Okay, and you know, and then you have the whole thing of lust and attachment and clinging and sense pleasure. Yeah, so again, you know, the story being like that is indicating that in our minds too, our minds are full of this kind of stuff, and we have to overcome it. And I think this is especially important for Buddhism in the West. Yeah, because there's a tendency for us We want samsara and nirvana at the same time. Yeah. Yeah, that's our middle way. Both samsara and nirvana. So I can have my sense pleasure deluxe, and I can also be an astute practitioner. Okay? This is not correct. Yeah. This is not correct. This does not work. No, the Buddha had to overcome all that lust, all that attachment. Yeah, he had to see that the whole thing is impermanent. Yeah, the whole thing is empty. There's nothing there that's worth clinging on to, because anything you cling on to is going to change and go away. Yeah. So some people nowadays see that as rather depressing. Oh, all my sense pleasure is going to disappear and go away. Oh, Buddhism is so depressing. Yeah. Actually, they don't understand it correctly, because the problem is not the external objects. The problem is our attachment to them. Yeah. So the problems in our life that occur, I mean, if we look, these things are transient. They do go away. And what happens then? We suffer. We forget that part. And we just look at the nice part. You know? Kind of the, oh, I'm madly in love part. But without seeing what that leads to. Okay? So, you know, the Buddha saw that the problem was the attachment, and we have to give up the attachment. If you give up the attachment, the objects don't disturb the mind. But until we've given up the attachment, we need to practice some restraint, because our mind is totally bonkers and uncontrolled. You know, we see something we like, and it's very difficult to control the mind, isn't it? Yeah, we see, you know, it can happen in a small things. There's chocolate. I got to get it. You know, that's a small example. But look at other things in our life where there's so much deep attachment that just runs the whole show, and that in the end leaves us with nothing. Yeah. So abandoning the attachment, you know, is what we need to do. Then the objects don't disturb our mind. We can have them, we cannot have them, and that's real freedom. So in the West, we think freedom is being able to go to the shopping center and get whatever you want, or having enough money where we can just pick up and go wherever we want when we want to go there. Or we think freedom is, you know, yeah, having our car, going here, going there, traveling here, traveling there, being with the kind of people we want to be with. We think that's what freedom is. But when there's attachment in our mind, that actually is imprisonment. We're imprisoned by our own attachment. You know, there's no freedom in our mind. We're just, the force of the attachment is like a huge tsunami that just pushes us. Okay? So, you know, until we can control that tsunami, we need to, you know, have some restraint. And I think also the restraint is important in light of the environmental degradation that our consumerism is causing. Yeah, that more than ever, you know, restraint in sense pleasure is required. I mean, in the Buddhist time, it was required for your spiritual practice, definitely. And all religions realize that. But now it's necessary, just even in a worldly way, so that we don't use up all the world resources and leave, you know, the next generation with not very much. Yeah? Leave more people, a huger population, with less resources. That's not compassionate. Okay? So now the restraint is, I think, really necessary, you know, and pulling ourselves out of this consumerist culture as much as we can. Okay, so the Buddha, finally conquered all these various demons in his mind, became fully awakened. After that, he didn't teach, the first 7 weeks, because he thought, who in the world is going to understand what I've just experienced? Yeah. And then, as the story goes, Brahma and Saka, these different, Indian deities, then requested him to teach. And so the purpose in the story for that is that Brahma and Saka, they were the ones who had the greatest worldly power. So if they beseech the Buddha to teach, then the Buddha must really have something to say. So it would kind of be like, envision this, Obama and Putin and, all the leaders of the countries and all the religious leaders, the Pope and everybody coming to request the Buddha to teach. Yeah. So that kind of feeling, of course that's not going to happen, but, we can visualize. Okay, so, and then the Buddha taught for 45 years, going all around India, teaching all these different kinds of people. Yeah, so many different kinds of people. And he taught poor people, he taught rich people, he taught Brahmins who had, their own religion. He taught the matted hair ascetics who were followers of different, ascetic teachers at that time. So, he talked to everybody. Everybody was included. The Dharma was freely given. Yeah, nobody had to pay to go and hear teachings. Yeah, the Buddha just taught. And then people came and said, we want to be your disciples. And then the first ordination was, come, O Bhikkhu. That was the way the ordination was given, just like that. Okay? Not a big ceremony. It's just, come, O Bhikkhu. That was it. And so the community of the Sangha started. Yeah, and so there became the fourfold assembly. Okay, so fully ordained monks and nuns, and upasikas and upasakas, lay people with the 5 precepts and refuge. So we had the fourfold, assembly, which is really important, and that's quite indicative of the Buddha Dharma existing in a place, as having that fourfold assembly. And so, again, that applies in our time spreading Buddhism to the West. Yeah, where's our fourfold assembly? Yeah, there's not so many monastics. We need more monastics, male and female. The women need full ordination. How about lay people? There's a lot of lay teachers now. I don't know how many of them keep all 5 precepts. Yeah, I think that's important. So, in thinking about spreading Buddhism in a country, we need to think and make sure we have the fourfold assembly. And then, of course, the Buddha passed away at the end, out in nature between 2 trees. Much of the Buddha's life happened outdoors in nature. In India you can live like that. Very beautiful. And then his teachings spread. Okay, So the Buddhist canons and the spread of the Dharma. So vehicle and path are synonymous. This is important. Many people don't realize this. Okay? And they don't refer to some external path. They refer to a consciousness in our mind. Okay? So while they are sometimes used to refer to a progressive set of spiritual practices, technically speaking, they refer to a wisdom consciousness conjoined with uncontrived renunciation or uncontrived bodhicitta. Okay. The Buddha turned the Dharma wheel, setting forth the practices of the three vehicles: the hearer vehicle, solitary realizer vehicle, and bodhisattva vehicle. According to the Sanskrit tradition, the three vehicles are differentiated in terms of their motivation to attain a specific goal, their principal meditation object, and the amount of merit and time necessary to attain those goals. Okay, so according to the Prasangika view, okay, for the hearer's vehicle, your motivation is to become an arhat, to be free of cyclic existence yourself. You mainly meditate on the four truths of the Aryas, and within 3 lifetimes you can attain arhatship. I think the Pali tradition says at least 7 lifetimes. Yeah. In the Sanskrit it is, and let me just see, in as little as 3 lifetimes. Okay, so a minimum of 3 lifetimes for the Sanskrit tradition. Okay, then the solitary realizer vehicle, motivation's the same, to become an arhat, to attain liberation, and they meditate principally on the 12 links of dependent arising, and then they practice for 100 eons. Okay, so they accumulate much more merit than the hearers do. Yeah, their object of meditation is slightly different, but the arhatship, the liberation they attain, is the same. Even though it's said that their body upon attaining non-abiding nirvana is more glorious than that of a hearer. Who cares what your body looks like when you're an arhat? But anyway, okay. And then the solitary realizer is also, they're so called because in their last life they appear in a world where you don't have a wheel-turning Buddha, such as Shakyamuni Buddha. Yeah, so they have the recall of the teachings because they had studied so much and learned so much and practiced so much in a previous life. Okay, the hearer vehicle is so called because they hear the teachings from a wheel-turning Buddha. Yeah, they put the teachings into practice, actualize the result, and then they cause other people to hear them say, I have accomplished the purpose of the holy life. I have eliminated all defilements. It's a stock passage in the Pali Canon, and they also cause people to hear the teachings. Okay. Then the Bodhisattva vehicle, the motivation is bodhicitta. The goal is full awakening, Buddhahood, and they mostly meditate on the emptiness of both persons and phenomena. And in the Sutrayana, that takes 3 countless great eons to accumulate the merit and gain the realizations to become a Buddha. The tantric vehicle is said to be faster. You could do it in this one life, but you have to be a very special person to do that. His Holiness, I've heard him say that sometimes he thinks that's like Chinese propaganda, and people just get too excited. Because I know we did, the first cohort of Westerners who found the Tibetan enlightenment, and it's like, we're going to do it. Yeah, and, until we realized we had to look at our minds and saw it's going to take longer, actually, you know. I mean, really, unless you're some kind of very exceptional person. Okay, so teachings and practitioners of all three vehicles exist in both the Pali and Sanskrit traditions. Okay, so like I said, they both have all three vehicles. In general, those practicing the hearer vehicle principally follow the Pali tradition, and those practicing the Bodhisattva vehicle principally follow the Sanskrit tradition. Nowadays in our world, hardly anyone follows the solitary realizer vehicle. Okay. The Buddha's teachings spread widely in India in the centuries after the Buddha lived, and was brought to Sri Lanka from India by King Ashoka's son and daughter in the 3rd century BC. Yeah. Now, King Ashoka, he was a Buddhist king. Of course, he got there because he was a very violent king initially, and after one particular battle, he was so horrified by the amount of killing that had happened that he became a Buddhist. But I thought he must be a very proud parent that both his son and daughter ordained, and then they spread the Buddhism to Sri Lanka, which was called Ceylon in those days, or Sinhala. Yeah. So Buddhism spread all throughout India. It went into Ceylon. Okay. The early sutras were transmitted orally by Banakas. Monastic job it was to memorize the sutras, and according to Sri Lankan sources, they were written down about the 1st century BCE to form what is now the Pali Canon. So Banaka, that's how the term Bhante came about. Yeah. So there were different groups of monastics who were assigned to memorize different groups of suttas, and then the whole tradition was passed down orally at that time, publicly orally. His Holiness thinks, that some of the Mahayana sutras could have been passed down in very small groups, or some of them could have been written down quite early. But at least the public Buddhism that was available there was passed down orally. And that's why you have in the Tibetan monasteries nowadays, and in the other traditions too, the Sangha doing a lot of memorization of scripture, because that's what you do. That's how the tradition was passed down, and it helps them to really keep the Dharma points in mind as well. They came to be written down in Sri Lanka because there was a famine, and they realized, a lot of people died, and there was one sutta that there was only one monk left who had the oral transmission. So then they thought, we're really in danger of losing so much. So they decided to write it down. So it was written down over a period of time. The Pali Canon wasn't closed for many centuries after that. It was still an open canon for quite a few centuries. Okay. Over the centuries, beginning in India and later augmented by Sinhala monks in the old Sinhala language, a body of commentaries on the scriptures built up. Okay, so you had the original sutras, then you had scripture, commentaries, primarily the Abhidharmikas, people of the Abhidharma commentaries who taught and wrote. Okay, and so that built up a whole system of commentaries. There were other commentaries too. They weren't all Abhidharma people. In the 5th century, the great translator and commentator Buddhaghosa compiled the ancient commentaries and translated them into Pali. Okay, so we don't really know what language the Buddha spoke. It seems like he didn't speak Pali, and he also didn't speak Sanskrit. He spoke some variety of Prakrit, which was the local language. He may have spoken more than one local language. I mean, considering that he went to so many different communities across northern India where they had so many different dialects and languages, you know, he may have spoken many different languages. And then, you know, we have Sanskrit and Pali come into the picture later on when the sutras were being written down and formalized, and the intelligentsia was really, you know, working on the sutras. So both Pali and Sanskrit were the languages of the intelligentsia, one in northern India, the other in southern India. But there's a lot of debate. Whoever you talk to is going to tell you something different about the languages. So, okay. Where were we? So Buddhaghosa also wrote the famous master, his famous master work, the Visuddhimagga, and numerous commentaries. So he was really instrumental in taking a lot of the commentaries from the ancient Sinhala monks and drawing out the important points, writing his own commentaries to the different sutras, and then translating all of that into Pali. And he must have been an incredible person. Okay. And then another South Indian monk, a century later, called Dhammapala, also wrote many commentaries in Pali. And Dhammapala's the one, he wrote this one called the Treatise, what is it? The Treatise on the Paramis. Paramis is like paramitas, the perfections, and that lays out the bodhisattva path in the Pali tradition. Okay, so it's written by Dhammapala. So we use passages from the canonical text and then added commentary. Then, beginning in the 1st century BCE, the Sanskrit tradition came into view and gradually spread in India. So philosophical systems in India, these developed really over the course of many, many centuries. The Vaibhasika, Sautrantrika, Yogacara, which also is called the Chittamadra, and the Madhyamaka. These evolved as scholars developed divergent views on points not explained explicitly in the sutra, or points that weren't developed well in the sutra. So you got different commentators coming out with different commentaries. These developed into philosophical tenets systems. Okay. Although many tenets of the Pali tradition are shared with one or another of these 4 tenet systems, it cannot be equated with any of them. Okay. Now, the origin of these tenet systems and the development of the tenet systems, I think, would make a really fascinating PhD dissertation. Yeah, because I've tried to investigate it a little bit. And, you know, the Tibetans say, well, everybody says that there were 18 schools initially, but everybody has a different list of what those 18 were. Okay, there's some common ones, but some traditions also, you know, or authors divide them into 4 groups or 2 groups or whatever. The Tibetans say all 18 were similar to the Vaibhasikas. They put them under the Vaibhasika tenet system. If you ask any Theravada Buddhist about Vaibhasika, they go, who are they? They never even heard the name, unless they're scholars who have read about Indian Buddhism, and then they say that Vaibhasika is a split-off branch of the Sravastivada, which was one of the 18. So, you know, how the Tibetans look at it, how the modern scholars, how other Buddhist traditions look at it, very, very different. Okay. When you get into China, you have talk of the Yogacarya school and the Madhyamaka school. Okay. I haven't heard them mention Vaibhasika and Sautrantrika. I could be mistaken, you know. Just because I don't know it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But it seems these schools developed in India. But, nowadays we learn them as part of our philosophical curriculum. And they're presented as done deals, as, okay, the Vaibhasikas believe this, the Satantrikas believe this, the Yogacharyas, like there's a set catechism for each of those traditions. Certainly it wasn't like that in India. Not at all. Okay? In India, you had people, because it was mostly the monastics who were involved in studying these things at that time. And you had people from studying different philosophies living in the same monastery, practicing together, doing their Vinaya recitations together. You had the big monastic universities going mostly from like 5th to early 13th century, and they had people from all the different traditions. And I don't think, that they had like, here's where all the Satantrikas go, and here's, I don't think it was like that. There are these names that came to exist in India, but they didn't become really fixed systems until you get to Tibet, because that was a Tibetan way of handling the massive amount of information that they were getting from India about different views that people had. Okay? So, but I think it would be fascinating to figure out historically how all these came about, because even, what later became called the Mahayana tradition, okay, it's presented now as like, okay, here's Mahayana, this is it, or here's Theravada, this is it. The term Theravada wasn't used until many centuries after the Buddha lived, and one of the first people recording using it was in India, and it referred to bodhisattva practitioners from Sri Lanka. Okay, so we really don't know, who the early Theravadas were. When Mahayana started, and it was mostly a spiritual goal, a goal of practicing, bodhicitta, attaining Buddhahood, okay? But you had people who were from the same Vinaya tradition who aspired for arhatship and aspired for Buddhahood living in the very same monasteries. Yeah? And they all got along. There's no problem. And, there were many points that they agreed on. And then they, at a certain point, they did the same practice. I mean, they were living in the monastery. I'm sure their chanting was the same. I'm sure they had a common meditation practice. And then the people who were Mahayana did something with a different motivation. Maybe they added another practice or two, something like that. It was only later that, it went from being a motivation to there being Mahayana scriptures that were publicly made. The people from the Sanskrit tradition have ways of describing why they weren't public at the beginning years. But in any case, they became more public later. And Mahayana became sets of scriptures. And then it was only after that, a few centuries after that, that it became a school, so to speak. Yeah? Or a vehicle, that was differentiated from the other vehicles or the other schools that were in India at that time. Yeah? Well, it's quite interesting because, whenever you study history, you get people looking back on what happened and categorizing things and predicting results from what happened earlier. When you're living it, you can't do that. It's all just happening. I mean, I'm sure somebody at some time is going to do several people will do doctoral theses on the origination of Buddhism in America, you know, and they'll go read all the minutes from the board meetings of, you know, Dharma centers and you know, watch videos of different things and write their dissertations, and they'll probably have all sorts of theories that they then impute back on what we're doing right now that we don't even think about. Okay, and this is, yeah, how things are. Yeah. Yeah, I studied history at university. That was my major, and, you know, this is my conclusion from it. Yeah, history is whatever you want it to be, basically. Yeah. So, yeah, because it's true. You know, most history is taught from the viewpoint of the ruling class. So you have wars, economic policies, you know. Yeah. I mean, most history is taught in terms of politics and wars, isn't it? Yeah. They don't teach history from the viewpoint of the common person. Yeah. What's it like to live in that country? You know, at that time, how do you think? They never teach history like that. Personally, I found studying about wars not very helpful. I think that's one element that made me become a Buddhist in the end. Yeah, but I won't go off on that diversion. Okay. So beginning in the 1st century BCE, the Sanskrit tradition came into view and gradually spread in India. So I already read that about the philosophical traditions. Okay, several monastic universities arose. Nalanda, Odantapura, and Vikramashila are a few. And from there, Buddhists from various traditions and philosophical schools studied and practiced together. Okay, and I read in a paper by Peter Skilling, there were nuns at Nalanda. Yes. Okay. Philosophical debate was a widespread ancient Indian custom. Yeah. Everybody did it, all the different traditions. Even from the time of the Buddha, when you look in the Pali Canon, the sutras, the Buddha's always debating with different people. You know? So people who say that there's no study involved, no reasoning involved in Buddhism, yeah, if they read and saw, you know, what's right there, the Buddha's always discussing philosophy. Yeah. Not complex, intricate things with, you know, the 5 divisions of this or such and such, but he's always debating points and really trying to get to the essence of how do things really exist. Okay, Buddhist sages developed logical arguments and reasonings to prove the validity of Buddhist doctrine and to deflect the philosophical attacks of non-Buddhists. Yeah. Okay, so this is actually quite important when you look at, well, let me finish the paragraph. Okay. The renowned Buddhist debaters were also great practitioners. Of course, not all Buddhist practitioners were interested in this approach. Many preferred to study the sutras or to practice meditation in hermitages. So you all, from the very get-go, you had people in hermitages, people doing retreat, people at these large monastic universities. Okay, but in India, you know, you had, as part of Indian culture, the development of many different philosophical systems. The Sakyas, I can't pronounce, Vaisheshikas, many of them, okay? Different philosophical traditions. And they would all debate together, and the Buddhists were challenged, and they had to respond. They had to engage in these debates, because the thing was, whoever lost the debate converted to the philosophy or religion of the winner. You know, because if you couldn't prove your system and the other guy could prove his, then his must be better, you know. because the Indians really respected reasoning, and you know, they use that a lot in their culture. So Buddhism really adapted to it, and and so because this kind of debate style was used at these great monastic universities, and these monastic universities were the source of Buddhism in Tibet, that's why the tradition, you know, was carried on there. Shantarakshita, who we'll get into that, one of the great Indian sages who brought Buddhism to Tibet, was a logician and a debater, you know, and everything rolled into one. And so he started them out on debate, and that system exists within all the Buddhist traditions to greater or lesser extents even now. You know? And it's interesting when you look. I can diverge here a little bit, and I must say I probably am partial. But in the many conferences I've gone to with Buddhist practitioners from other traditions, you can see that the education that happens in the Tibetan tradition is much more thorough than commonly happens in the average monasteries. Of course, in different traditions, it certainly depends on the practitioner. But I'm talking here in terms of curriculums and, you know, the general programs in monasteries. You can really see that. And I think it comes because Tibetan Buddhism is an extension of the Nalanda tradition. Now, of course, the Chinese Buddhism is also an extension of the Nalanda tradition. But here's a very good example of how culture influences a place. In China, due to Confucian ethics and Confucian culture, it was very rude for gentlemen to debate. Extremely rude. And to be victorious in a debate and make somebody lose face, you didn't do that. So the system of debate, you know, didn't catch hold in China because of the difference in culture. Tibet was like a very uncultured place, and they became cultured due to Buddhism. Their written language came from Buddhism, okay, and the whole tradition. So it was easier to start different habits in Buddhist monasteries in Tibet than in China, because China, I mean, it was and continues to be a very sophisticated culture, yeah. But we'll get into that, but it made it sometimes more difficult for Buddhism to be accepted there because of the sophisticated culture. Okay. Nowadays, 3 canons exist: the Pali, Chinese, and Tibetan. A Sanskrit canon was not compiled in India, which I find very interesting. No Mahayana canon was compiled in India. Yeah, why? You have Tibetan canon, you have Chinese canon, you know, and Buddhism had gone there, you know, to China quite early on. But no Sanskrit canon. Okay, part of it, I think, was because you had these 18 schools, and they all had, you know, the 3 baskets, Vinaya, Sutra, and Abhidharma, and they all had their own rendition of those. I would suspect that there probably wasn't much variety between them because the Banakas were pretty accurate in passing things down, but enough variety so that there could be 18 schools, you know. So, you know how sentient beings are. It's like, you know, we always divide into our own little thing here. And we really know very little about the 18 schools, very little. Sometimes they continue to find some very early sutras, but mostly in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. They found some in Dunhuang before. But, so much of what was written in northern India was written on leaves, and it just deteriorates. And then once you had the Mongol invasion, Buddhism was wiped out. So we don't know much about these 18 schools, or where they were, how they had different philosophies, what sutras they had in common. Yeah, we know more about the Theravada, which is one of the 18, because it was isolated down in Sri Lanka. Yeah, but the ones in India, it's very difficult to know Buddhist history there. So maybe somebody started at one point doing a canon, and it got it wiped out. We don't know. Okay. Each canon is divided into 3 baskets, or pitaka, or categories of teachings, which are correlated with the 3 higher trainings. So the Vinaya basket deals chiefly with monastic discipline. The Sutra basket emphasizes meditative concentration, and the Abhidharma basket is mainly concerned with wisdom. Having said this, I'm always puzzled that the perfection of wisdom sutras are not in the Abhidharma basket, they're in the Sutra basket. Okay? The Chinese canon was first published in 983, and several other renditions were published later. The standard edition used now is the Taisho, which was published in Tokyo in 1934. And that has been entirely digitized. Remarkable. Yeah. I think the Pali Canon might have been entirely digitized too. I don't think the Tibetan Canon has. Do you know? No? Either of you know? I don't think so. Okay. So the Chinese canon, the Taisho, consists of 4 parts: the sutras, Vinaya, Shastras, or treatises, and miscellaneous texts originally written in Chinese. The Chinese canon is very inclusive, sharing many texts with both the Pali and Tibetan canons. In particular, the agamas in the Chinese canon correspond to the first 4 Nikayas in the Pali canon. So my understanding is the Chinese canon is actually the most inclusive of all of them, in terms of the wide variety of material. It doesn't have all the tantras that the Tibetan canon does, but these agamas that it has are very important. In the Pali canon, the scriptures are in 5 Nikayas, or collections, okay? 4 of those exist, they're called the 4 agamas, in the Chinese canon. And they consist of the same sutras that are in the Pali canon, but of course, since they came to China, some of them may have come from Sri Lanka, some of them may have come through Central Asia. Again, there's different, the oral tradition, different things were changed. A friend of mine, Analayo, is doing a lot of study comparing the Nikayas and the Agamas, and it's really fascinating. And when I read his stuff, I can see in the Agamas, yes, they're just like the Pali, but there's certain ways, some of the differences in them are already going towards being more inclusive and speaking more about love and compassion and including many different kinds of people. Just much, I don't know, there's sometimes a different flavor, even though the majority of the sutra may be exactly the same. Okay? So here's the Chinese with this whole collection of agamas, which they share with the Pali canon. Plus, They have, a huge collection of Mahayana sutras, most of which are shared with the Tibetan canon. They have a few tantras. Tantra didn't really catch on very much in China. The Tibetans have a lot of tantras. Yeah, and in the Tibetan canon, this is the Kangyur, so this is all the sutras. Yeah, and that's the Tengyur, which are all the Indian commentaries. Yeah, so that's 108 volumes, that's 225. Yeah, quite a lot to learn. That's why when we pay respect to them, we hit our head and kind of pray, may I eventually someday, learn everything that's written in these. The Tibetan canon was redacted and codified by Bhutan Rinpoche in the 14th century. The first rendition of the Tibetan canon was published in 1411 in Beijing. Isn't that interesting? The Chinese canon was published in Tokyo, the Tibetan canon was published in Beijing. Later editions were published in Tibet at Nartang in 1731 to 1742, and later in Derge and Chone. The Tibetan canon is composed of the Kangyur, the Buddha's words, in 108 volumes, and the Tengyur, the Great Indian Commentaries, in 225 volumes. Most of these volumes were translated into Tibetan directly from Indian languages, chiefly Sanskrit, although a few were translated from Chinese and Central Asian languages. Yeah, the Chinese canon, we don't know the agamas, what language were they translated from, If they came through Central Asia, they could have been in Sanskrit, they could have been in Gandhari, or they could have been in some other Central Asian language. Yeah, some of them probably came from Sri Lanka, because Buddhism did go to China through Sri Lanka. Then it would have been translated, the later things that came to China from Pali. The earlier ones, maybe from Sinhala. We don't know. Okay. And, Buddhism used to be so extensive in Central Asia. Yeah, it just flourished for centuries in Central Asia and translated to many languages there. Went to China from there. Also, many of the Tibetans' sutras came from Central Asia. But Buddhism went to China several centuries before it went to Tibet. Yeah, so different sutras, became better known in China than they did in Tibet, simply because of the time period in which they came. Yeah. So, for example, the tantras way of practicing didn't get popular until maybe 7th, 8th century. And although the Tibetan sage Nagarjuna wrote a treatise on the Tantra. But which Nagarjuna? Oh, I better not say that. Okay. The Tibetans say Nagarjuna lives 600 years. I don't know. Anyway. So Tantras became popular in India much later, and at that time, Buddhism had most of the Buddhist scriptures had already gone to China. So, and they had Buddhism there, and they had some of their own writings and commentaries there. So they weren't importing so much at that time. Whereas that was the time when the Tibetans really, when they first came to know about Buddhism, and were bringing lots of scriptures in, And by the time the Tibetans were doing that, the 18 schools, I think most of them probably had, died out or been absorbed into others. The Sravastivada, which was very strong in northern India. I think that one must have existed because a lot of the, Tibetan teachings in the Vaibhasika Satantrika tenet systems were from Sravastivada texts, or Mula Sravastivada. We don't know what the relationship between Sravastivada and Mula Sravastivada is, except Mula Sravastivada seemed to appear later. But anyway, so a lot of what you have in the different countries depends on what was available in India at the time Buddhism started going to that place. Yeah? And so it's interesting thinking of Buddhism coming to the West now, because what kind of materials are being translated, and what's popular in different Asian countries, and how are people bringing it? In ancient times, like Xuanzang from China, he brought mountains of scriptures back with him. There were several of the Chinese who, incredible, brought tons of scriptures back with them. Now do we bring scriptures back with us? Yeah. Some people do. And you have some remarkable Buddhist scholars in the West. Most people bring back malas and pictures and these kinds of things. Yeah. And now what's being translated, a lot from, you have a lot of the Tibetan oral teachings being translated into English. Yeah. The Tibetan original commentaries, not so many. Now starting to work on the Indian treatises and commentaries, get more of those translated. Chinese Buddhism in the West, very much it tends to be more insular for the Chinese community, although they've translated some Mahayana sutras. Yeah. Theravada, I think, has really done the best in terms of translating the scriptures. Yeah. So what's getting translated into English is going to make a huge difference in how Buddhism develops here, in addition to how people are bringing Buddhism back from Asia. Did people go to Asia and study there, and did it bring it back, or did they mostly learn it here? Or, what did people study? Or did, a lot of Westerners are mostly interested in meditation, so they learn meditation in Asia. They bring back the meditation techniques. What about the scriptures? Yeah. So we have, what's going on now, like I said, somebody's going to write their dissertation about in a century. So it's quite interesting, and all that will influence the development of the Buddha Dharma in different Western countries, in addition to the culture and politics and so on and climate of the different countries.